In staff rooms across Kenya, teachers whisper what policymakers won't admit, a curriculum that looks less like reform and more like repackaged pressure. It demands individualized learning in under-resourced schools, innovation without investment, and transformation without trust. The burden is real and it's political. Welcome and welcome back to Elimu Café. My name is Teacher Leah, a teacher and an educator. So they told us that CBC would make learning relevant, practical, and modern. But what they didn't tell us is that behind the buzzwords lies an ideology, one that shifts responsibility from the state to parents, turns teachers into technicians, and learners into miniature entrepreneurs. So this is not just a curriculum. It is a mirror of liberal Kenya. So what exactly am I talking about? When we talk about systems, we look at economic systems, political systems, and how they influence curriculum implementation and also a curriculum adaptation. But today, I want us to look at neoliberalism as one of the key components that has been adapted in this country and has really affected how we look at our education in general. And this will form the basis of my critique or my analysis of the CBC curriculum, or what we call now the CBE curriculum. Now, I'm not an economist, nor am I a political scientist, but neoliberalism is actually more on that area. But I just want to explain it in simple terms, just the way I understand it. And neoliberalism, as I say, it's government step aside and let the market handle it. In simple terms, it's that the government takes the back seat while the market forces of demand and supply handle the various aspects of life as we know it. Now, this ideology emerged in the late 20th century, and it was just a revamp or sort of like a remix of the classical ideologies of liberalism that were in the past. And neoliberalism is just sort of like an updated, like an updated version of modern economics. And what it does is that it tells us that, everything has to be on the free market and limited state interference. That's pretty much it. But this lesson today is not going to be on economics. Let us look at how it plays out in education. Now, when neoliberalism logic enters education, schools are not just for public good. Schools become markets. When schools become markets, the language shifts from learning and it moves into outputs, efficiency, and competition. So when we talk about neoliberalism and how it affects education, it affects various things. And what I'm going to say after this is going to be some of the examples that you will notice because you are a proponent of this neoliberalist ideology, whether you did the 844 curriculum or if your child is currently going or taking of this CBC or CBE curriculum. Now, one, education becomes a marketplace. What does that mean? It means that there's competition for funding, there's competition that includes ranking, students become the customer, and parents also become the clients. And you know that very well, especially if your child is in a private school. I'm a private school director, and we call our children clients at this point because that's what the market dictates. And this fundamentally shifts the conversation from social good to us discussing education as a market. Now, the role of private schools also increases significantly as an alternative to public schools. And already, I don't need to say much about that. Data, even you yourself, if you're watching this, you are very aware that children now are accessing private schools more as an alternative to what we call a failing or a failed public school system. Now, public schools are also told to mimic private schools as models to stay competitive. And I want to give you an example. When the JS program was starting, the late Professor Magoha, may God rest his soul, visited a private school as a model school of which parents, teachers, and stakeholders are supposed to look at and understand how JS works. Already you can see that private schools are being used to model what is expected of education as we know it. Now, funding also reduces and the government cuts direct spending into education. So you find that now, the child is paying certain amounts. This was not very possible. That was not very true during Kenya Kibaki's time, but you notice it through bursaries, the stories we talk about bursaries, when you talk about you're going to school but the government is paying some part and you're paying some part, that is also one of the effects of this neoliberal ideology. Then you can see PPPs growing. PPPs are private-public partnerships. That is also one indicator of the same. You'll also notice that there are a lot of corporate actors who come into the education space. These are publishers, printers, assessment providers, trainers, anybody who comes into this education space, edtech providers. They're coming in as a way to influence or to gain power and then influence education policy. This is because of the free market ideology, which is now what we call the neoliberal ideology. Now, you'll also notice that attention shifts to standardized testing. And you know standardized testing, for those who did the 844, you know standardized testing is maybe KCPE, KCSE. Right now we're talking about standardized testing through the KEPSEA and the KJSEA that is currently going to be in its first round if you're watching this in 2025. And so you find that everything becomes a measurable outcome, whereby everything becomes either, like for now, we can talk about it in the terms of, are they met expectations? Are they achieving expectations? There's a matrix, there's a rubrics that will dictate assessment outcomes. And also, teachers are also get assessed on the same. They get assessed on performance. You find that your performance contract, if you're a private school teacher or you're a public school teacher, it all boils down to, okay, how many students got A's? How many students are achieving expectations? How many students are exceeding expectations? A lot of the conversation shifts towards learner results. Also, you find that you'll notice people are publishing or schools are publishing data, rankings. For those of you who experienced the 844, and some of you actually were on those buses, you find that our school has 5 A's, you see the teachers and the students all in the buses celebrating our school was #1. That's one of the ways in which accountability goes into metrics and testing as part and parcel of this free market ideology. Now, when you look at the teachers who are the core or the center of education, who are mostly the pathway of knowledge, they now become technicians. What does that mean? The teachers now have to follow a rigid curriculum. Curriculum is not just out of the blues. They have to follow a particular curriculum because it's tailored towards a particular market. Teachers also have to meet quantifiable targets. That's why I was saying a teacher will be asked by their director or by the sub-county director or by the head teacher how many students are performing. Maybe, for example, how many students are getting 80s, how many students are getting A's, how many students are exceeding expectations. All this is to emphasize on the performance contract, and the appraisals actually are based on these outputs. Another way you'll notice is that education becomes for employability and not for social good. Employability means that the curriculum shifts focus to what does the market need. I am sure you've heard statements like 21st century learning, STEM, employability, entrepreneurship, because that's what is hot right now. That's what the market needs. So education shifts towards that particular market need. And you find that if you notice now, humanities and the arts and civic education are more or less taking a backseat, because is that what the market needs really? Not really. The market needs a 21st century learner who is digitally enabled and all the things that we've been hearing in the market, and that demands or describes or dictates what the education system will have to churn out. Now, the goal essentially becomes producing employable children, producing employable individuals rather than a well-rounded citizen. So that's why you'll find that schools will spend hours and hours training children on becoming good in math or becoming good in sciences, because that's what the system or that's what the market is requiring. Now, parents and learners, as I said earlier, become consumers. They're called now consumers. You find that they're making choices. You've probably made a choice of to which school your child will go to, which subjects is my child going to go to. The illusion is there, but it's very limited because it is dictated by pricing, it's dictated by geography, it's dictated by a lot of, the children's marks and things like that. But if your child is in a private school system, already you can understand what I'm talking about in consumer, your child being a consumer, and they're called end users and you being the paying customer. So this is because that's what the market forces are dictating. Then you find that now, because of this, some of the responsibility of education outcomes is shifted from the state to the individual, and you choose to bear that cost. And we'll talk more about that later as we continue. And so in a nutshell, the citizen becomes a consumer, the learner becomes human capital, the school becomes a business and the teacher becomes a service provider. So that, in a nutshell, is what neoliberalism is all about. Now, when you look at that in its critique of that ideology itself, one, it widens the inequality. Inequality being that some people, that, I don't know if you've ever read the book called Animal Farm, there they say some animals are more equal than others. Because, for example, if you're in a location where the schools are good and the schools are well funded, or they are good private schools, your child is likely to do better than a child who is in the opposite, or where the opposite is true. The other thing that happens is that the public purpose is lost, and education's social mission of citizenship, of justice, of identity is overshadowed by economic goals. Now, the other thing that happens is that the focus narrows, and it has sort of like a tunnel vision, because the teacher, the school, the entire ecosystem demands for tests. The tests are the indicators of whether the child is learning. So it becomes that everything goes to test scores. What is my child getting? And not about curiosity. How do we test critical thinking? Once again, we narrow it down to test scores. So everything becomes test scores, results, alipata nini, and the works. And so that in itself is a critique, because education is supposed to be all-encompassing. It's supposed to be a place where you can find yourself and things like that. But if the primary focus is on that test score, then a lot of energy is shifted towards that. The other thing that I think happens, or we can also see right now, is that the morale of the teacher drops, because now there's a lot of over-surveillance, and this leads to a lot of burnout and unnecessary professional development, which is a sign of lack of respect. The other thing that I would say is a critique is now the local culture is ignored. Why? Because we are gearing towards the market. So if the market is demanding that our children should learn French, then that's what our children will learn. And so the local context is ignored. In what? So that we can be able to achieve that which is the international standard or the world market standard. And you can see that in the way we teach our children, for example, foreign languages against the indigenous languages of our country. There was a time when CBE introduced indigenous languages, but you could see how it was frowned upon. Why? Because it does not align to the market forces. A parent is most likely to pay thousands of shillings for their child to go study French, German, or the likes. But when it comes to indigenous languages, you'll find that there's a bit of a push and shove. Now, let's look at the Kenyan context further and discuss now, when did this happen? It started in the 1980s, of course, as this was the time also neoliberalism was being given its makeover. It was being pushed by the likes of Margaret Thatcher, the likes of Ronald Reagan, and whatnot. Now, this you can notice through the SAPs. For you guys who did the SAPs, remember the SAPs of World Bank, this is when we started discovering cost sharing, where now you're paying some amount and your parent is paying some amount of school fees. Like us, when we studied, we used to have a development fee where my parent was expected to pay, I think it was 200 shillings and 100 for a diary. Those small amounts is what now we are calling the cost sharing ideology, a part of the ideology actually of neoliberalism. So you find even now if your child is in high school, you're still expected to pay a fee because the system has gone into a cost sharing aspect. And then you'll notice that towards the 1980s and even later, and especially now, there's a big private school boom because again, the market forces are now coming in. The market forces are dictating that, private schools will give a better alternative. They're giving an illusion of choice. And so there's a very huge private school boom. And personally, I'm part of that. I'm not going to say that I'm not. It's just, that's what I'm saying. This is what is happening. This is a reality of the economic and political systems we live in. Then you'll find that now public accountability measures go towards test scores. For example, as I said before, measurability comes into standardized testing, KCPE, KCSE, KPSEA, TPADs for teachers, and things like that. Then you'll notice that curriculums are then framed towards employability, adaptability, and market readiness. Let me give an example. When you look at senior school, you'll notice that we're being told that STEM, which is the career pathway, one of the pathways, is taking more space because that's what the market dictates. That's what the future is like. And so it's really just gravitating towards what the market requires, while the rest, in one or another, they're taking a backseat. Also, you'll find that there's a lot of partnerships with private individuals and private companies. Now you've seen the boom with edtech companies. You've seen a lot of conversations with publishers because they are coming in and they're entering the learning spaces because the learning space now has become a market. Now, The people who support this ideology say that, one, this drives efficiency and innovation, which is true. There are so many things that are happening now, and it's because, of course, private players have been allowed into this education space. The other thing that has happened is that there is increased parental choice. You now have a lot of choices. In the past, you were limited maybe to only public schools. Now you can take your child to a private school. The beauty of choice has been introduced in this particular ideology. And also, there's also improved accountability for those who believe in this particular ideology. And it also aligns the children or the education with the job market. But of course, the critics still complain and say, me being one of them, that what it does is that it commodifies learning and it deepens inequality. All right. Now looking at that and discussing this whole conversation around CBC, around ideologies, and which is not the neoliberal ideology, let us now circle it back to the CBC curriculum and see how it ties to that particular ideology. When CBC was introduced and what is now called CBE, remember we spent a lot of money to do a new launch to call it CBE, we were told that CBC is going to shift from rote learning to competency mastery. The competencies, we discussed them in a previous episode. You remember it's the communication and collaboration. There were all these conversations around critical thinking and problem solving, digital learning, citizenship, and the works. Please check out that episode for more information on that. Now, the focus was, of course, now shifting on the skills, and those are the competencies we talked about. There was also a lot of conversation that will shift towards citizenship as a value, and of course, attitudes towards education in general. And so, what they were trying to say is that it's going to promote a learner-centered approach, and it's going to prepare learners again for the job market and for the 21st century skills. Now, based on what we've discussed, you can already see that it sounds good, yes, but when you dig deeper into it, you will note that it mirrors the global neoliberal education reforms. That is for efficiency, for employability, and for productivity. Let's dive deeper into this and look at it this way. Education through CBC is viewed as a pipeline. So it's a pipeline to the economy rather than the social good. And as I said earlier, social good means that education is for citizenship, it's for justice. But now, education is a pipeline to the economy. And so the focus is for these competencies that will align with the job market and not necessarily on the local cultural goals. Now, when we focus on the skills, which becomes a new emphasis in CBC, again, the education is still focusing on what? To ensure that learners are economically productive. Because again, the market forces demand for that. And so you'll find that there's a lot of devolution of cost. Devolution of cost is very prevalent for all of you parents who are currently doing CBE. You have been asked for materials, CBC materials. People have even opened businesses. Bookshops have now segmented themselves into CBC materials. Why? The school is supposed to, not the school really, but the government is only providing a bare minimum while pushing the conversation on supplies to parents. So the parents are providing learning materials, the schools are improvising infrastructure, they are sourcing for digital content, while the government does what? It takes a step back. And that's really what neoliberalism is all about, that the government is supposed to have little interference and the market takes charge. So you find that the hands-off approach is actually just in nature with what neoliberalism is all about. And then you find that as much as we're talking about, there's flexibility and, it's not as complex as 844, there's still a lot of emphasis on assessment rubrics. It's very, very prominent. And also you'll find that there's a lot of reporting and a lot of performance expectation that is usually a demonstration of measurable outcomes. So it's not about deep learning per se, but it's about, as I said, the rubrics. Is it meeting expectations? Is it achieving expectations? And the teacher is always expected to go online. Like right now, and as we're shooting this, there's a NEC exam that is called the CBA, the school-based assessment, and the children are now currently doing assessments, and teachers, especially teachers with big number of students, have to sit on a laptop and enter the data. So a lot of the emphasis is actually on the monitoring through the rubrics and the assessment processes. Now, the PPPs, of course, the public-private partnerships have also benefited greatly You've seen a lot of conversation between education technology, marrying with publishers, marrying with assessment firms. There's a lot of private actors who are now shaping public education. I can go ahead and even say that there are allegations that a lot of the publishers did actually influence how the curriculum designs are going to look like for the CBE curriculum. So you find, as I told you before, because of the introduction of private players into the education space, then they can bring in power and influence policy in general. Now, the one thing that also has come in is that the teacher has become a manager. The role of the teacher is now a lot more managerial. What do I mean by that? There's a lot of filling forms, as I said earlier, entering data into systems. You have to be digitally aware or digitally competent for you to be able to do some of these things. The teacher now is expected to follow a rigid curriculum, which, as I said, is also very prominent in 844. But now you can see now, especially now, the teachers have become more or less technicians and not, they're not the knowledge givers per se, but they've become more of technicians, and their work is to deliver outputs. And you can see that even in the performance contracts. You'll see that even teachers who watch this, they'll tell you there are schools where you're asked, why did your students not do well? You have to now, either you're fired, you're given a warning, you're given a performance improvement plan. All these things now become output-based. And what are the results? We have, again, the schools that are equal, that are more equal than others. The wealthier schools, in terms of resources, in terms of capacity, in terms of infrastructure, they benefit, while the poor schools will continue struggling. And that is very common right now. You can see it in schools that are thriving, and those are the schools that are used as model schools, while the rest are lingering in confusion, they're lingering in lack of resources, and they're lingering in lack of an idea of how to move forward. Let me give a very good example right now with the senior school program. There's children who have selected C1 all the way to C4 schools. But why is there a categorization? It's because of the availability of resources, availability of infrastructure, and what exactly does it mean when you're talking about education for equality, yet these schools are still segmented in different levels, and hence a child who goes to a C4 school is assumed to not receive the same level of education as a C1 school. Even when you talk about it, even I as a private school owner, the kind of experience that my learners are getting versus the kind of experience that public school students are getting is almost night and day. We are currently located next to a public school, and you can see the differences, even because of their economic status, and also because of the amount of state and interference, or rather the step back approach that has rendered them crippled in making sure that this curriculum is a success as it was anticipated. But then there's also a lot of burnout as teachers, as professionals, because you're constantly now in that loop. You're supposed to teach. When you're done teaching, you're supposed to update data. When you're done updating data, you're supposed to go for some training. There's a lot of burnout, I believe, even for my teachers who are watching and anybody else who's in this space right now. It's very managerial, it's very hectic, and so that in itself is one of the critiques that I will bring forward in this conversation. And of course then, as I said, there's a lot of increased cost. Increased cost is very prominent. You see now parents are being told to bring photocopy papers in school. You're being told to bring, some schools are asking you to bring art equipment. There's so many things that you're being asked to bring so that your children can experience the curriculum as is expected, instead of the state providing these particular things. And the other thing that happens is that there's a lot of local content or lack of contextualizing a particular curriculum. I want to give you something very interesting that happened last year. If your child was in the CBE curriculum, you noticed that they were told to go for some swimming lessons. At what point was that supposed to be feasible for schools that do not have a swimming pool? So you'll find videos, if you check on your social media, you'll find the videos of children swimming on grass as a way of trying to imitate what swimming is like. There's a time they actually launched, I remember when I was in that launch, they launched the coding program as a compulsory unit or a compulsory segment of the science and technology subject area. But then, how many children actually have access to laptops or to tablets or even to internet access or even to electricity to enable them to be able to achieve these particular objectives? So, in a nutshell, you might say that there are people who advocate for it and they'll say, definitely, schools, the skill-based learning is relevant in modern economies, and competencies, of course, they promote that holistic learner. And on top of that, the decentralization of implementation will allow for local adaptation. So let me conclude by saying, Maybe CBC is not a curriculum, but it is a symptom, a sign that we have stopped asking what kind of people education should build and started asking what kind of workers the economy needs. So until we reclaim education as a public good and not a private hustle, we will keep producing skilled citizens who can ask or do everything except question why. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for watching till the end of this segment, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about the CBE curriculum. We shall start a new segment next time to talk about IGCSE and also analyze how that is working in our Kenyan context. I appreciate you and I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.